Seduction is not merely a matter of sex. It can be a way to make sales, gain political power, or generally persuade others in the service of one's own goals. With close psychological analysis, careful planning, and a dash of theatrical flair, seducers can tear down victims' resistance to get exactly what they want. Seducers aren't necessarily born, although it can be a natural talent. More often, seducers are self-made. There are two key steps to any type of seduction: understanding oneself and understanding the target. There are 9 different types of seducers, and it's important for each seducer to identify his or her type. While these categories aren't mutually exclusive, people tend to naturally gravitate towards a main type. The 2 most overtly sexual types of seducers are sirens and rakes. Sirens, the most powerful seducers, have an outpouring of dramatic sexual energy that lures victims. Rakes are more aggressive than magnetic. They like pursuit. Rakes' devotion to a conquest can be high and feverish, but their attention spans are often short. Ideal lovers, naturals, and charmers are 3 types that are not so overtly sexual. Ideal lovers have a mythical quality and appeal to the ideals of high storybook romance. Naturals are people who convey a sense of childlike wonder. They avoid all forms of artifice. Charmers are somewhat platonic with only a hint of sexual possibility, relying mostly on their skill in pleasing people through flattery and attention. Dandies are people who dabble in androgyny, either through appearance or by subverting gender roles in social settings. Often they appeal to people's repressed desire to flaunt society's rules. Coquettes are emotionally withdrawn and maintain a degree of remove from their targets. They're inscrutable and aloof, which is often attractive. The last 2 types of seducers, charismatics and stars, have widespread appeal. Charismatics have the preternatural confidence that's common in popular politicians. Stars are more mysterious, carrying a dreamlike quality that's just as appealing, but more difficult to pin down. Generally speaking, seduction requires trained focus on the victim's psychological makeup, rather than on the seducer's personal desires. The best seducers get what they want through a sort of goal-oriented empathy. They seek understanding of other people so they can control them. Anti-seducers make the mistake of being too self-absorbed, with an inward focus that other people tend to find repellent. There are about twice as many types of victims as there are seducers. All victims share one essential problem: they are missing something in their lives. The seducer's job is to identify that missing piece and then provide it. Seduction is, at its heart, a strategic enterprise. The seducer's job is to analyze a target to suss out strengths and weaknesses. Strategies can be mixed and matched to suit the situation, but generally the goal is to break down the target's defenses. A seducer enchants without revealing too much information, constantly working to gain trust without letting the full truth, whatever it may be known. People are narcissists, so a bit of flattery can go a long way towards ingratiating the victim. Ideally, the victim will find the seducer fascinating, but never overly familiar. When the victim gets too close, psychologically or emotionally, misdirection is required. Some people are naturally more seductive than others, but with careful planning and close analysis, anyone can succeed at the art of seduction. Seducers must enhance their natural charisma to make themselves as appealing to victims as possible. Charisma exists on a spectrum. The seducer's project is to amplify his or her own natural charisma, however small it may be in the beginning, to become a more compelling version of his or herself. As recently as the 20th century, psychologists believed that likability, much like intelligence or happiness, was more or less a fixed trait. But more recent research suggests that charisma can be cultivated with effort. Researchers have linked charisma to fixed permanent characteristics over which people have no control, like height. For example, in one study, tall managers were better liked by their subordinates than their shorter counterparts. At the same time, charisma can be linked to other personal qualities that are mutable on a day-to-day basis, some of which relate more to habit and behavior than physique. For example, research suggests that well-rested people are more charismatic than tired people. Simple tweaks to body language and speaking habits, including posture, eye contact, and voice modulation, can also boost personal charisma. Often, these behaviors are controllable, even though they usually exist outside of conscious awareness. Seducers can try pausing for a few seconds before taking their turn in a conversation as a quick and easy way to boost their charisma quotient. Another tactic is demonstrating one's full and attentive presence over the course of a conversation, instead of being distracted by, say, a cell phone. Mindfulness meditation, the practice of devoting one's full attention to whatever is happening in a given moment, can help seducers develop conspicuous listening skills. A seducer should cultivate a mysterious persona. Seduction thrives on inscrutability and instability. Seducers should try to seem mysterious and even a little emotionally volatile to keep the victim guessing. A good seducer can maintain the advantage by staying a step or two ahead of the victim at all times. Being mysterious might not be as difficult as it sounds, as people often seem inscrutable to others without even trying. According to psychologists, a lot of misunderstandings are rooted in a phenomenon called the transparency illusion, which is when someone naturally assumes that whatever he or she is thinking about is immediately obvious to other people. For example, without ever saying anything out loud, Tiffany might automatically assume that Jason knows she's in a bad mood because she's tired. She feels as though her tiredness is simply obvious to everyone, which is the transparency illusion at work. Meanwhile, Jason has no idea how tired Tiffany is. After all, she never mentioned it, so he just assumes that she's angry with him. In terms of seduction, this misunderstanding inadvertently serves Tiffany well. Jason will feel confused about what he's done to make her mad, which gives Tiffany an advantage. Since so many people miscommunicate by default, the implication is that very often, the only action necessary for cultivating a sense of mystery and volatility is to avoid correcting other people's misconceptions or stating their true feelings clearly. With the example of Tiffany and Jason, if he were to confront her about her anger, the worst thing she could do in terms of seduction would be to admit she was in fact tired, not mad. Transparency is not seductive. Instead, she should ignore Jason's request for clarity or invent a reason for her unhappiness. People are naturally narcissistic, so they're attracted to others who share similar sensibilities and interests. People are drawn to others who share their personality traits and tastes. Therefore, the ideal seduction involves a target who is naturally similar to the seducer in some way. In a 2016 study, researchers compared the personalities of different kinds of pairs, including romantic partners and close friends, and found that people really are motivated to spend time with others who have similar attitudes and interests. Indeed, the phenomenon was so common that researchers think it's more than just a trend. It's something closer to the default. These similarities across pairs go deeper than just hobbies and preferences. Researchers have found that romantic couples tend to share socioeconomic backgrounds. This phenomenon is known as assortative mating, a term borrowed from the animal world. Some researchers worry that people's tendency to marry within the same economic class is deepening social inequities. In 2015, the New York Times reported that assortative mating may be responsible for as much as a third of the increase in the wealth gap in the U.S. from 1960 to 2005.
Seducers should subtly mimic targets' behaviors and moves. Similarities between two people can fan the flames of attraction, but when no naturally occurring similarities exist, a seducer can act like the target in the moment, if not on a more permanent basis. A seducer can fake similarities using mirroring techniques. By copying the target's body language, gestures, facial expression, and even vocal inflection, for example, it's possible for seducers to make themselves more appealing. When mirroring occurs between two people without conscious intention, such as when two people fold their arms in exactly the same way during a long conversation, it's known in psychology as the chameleon effect. But mimicry can also be purposeful. The key is to make sure the copycat behavior is subtle. It shouldn't come across as deliberate or worse, mocking. Mirroring works not only in romantic situations, but also among platonic friends and professional colleagues, according to psychologists. In a job interview or a meeting, for example, mirroring the person in charge can come across as subtly flattering. Salespeople and other professionals who depend on personal connections, such as negotiators, might use mirroring to deepen the conversation, even if it starts on a note of hostility. Targets should set the pace of the conversation. For instance, if they speak slowly, seducers should slow their speech to match. If targets slouch, seducers should relax their posture too. Even when the seducer is not engrossed in the conversation, a conscious attempt to mirror the target will likely deepen the discussion, focus attention, and build rapport. Stagnation kills seduction. New experiences help keep things interesting. A seducer must hold a victim's rapt attention. An effective tactic is to keep the person guessing so he or she doesn't grow bored with being seduced over time. Waning interest is death to seduction. Conventional wisdom suggests that new romantic relationships are more exciting than long-term partnerships, a claim that science seems to back. Research suggests that when a romance is in its early stages, the brain's dopamine levels spike in the same way that occurs with substance use. However, these spikes in dopamine aren't sustainable, so inevitably the excitement fades away. Arthur Aaron, a psychology professor who studies romantic relationships, suggests that one easy way to reignite a stagnant romantic relationship is to try new activities, which reactivates the neural pathways associated with new relationships. New experiences boost levels of dopamine, which is related to pleasure, and norepinephrine, which helps people feel alert. These neurotransmitters make people feel happier and excited. Aaron's research shows that couples who seek out new experiences tend to be happier than those who stick to their same routines. Couples who have been together for a long time tend to fall into routines, such as going to the same restaurant every weekend or taking the same vacation each summer. While those activities may be pleasant, they won't have the same effect as trying out new experiences. New activities could include something simple, such as a cooking class, or a large undertaking like traveling, or even moving to an unfamiliar country. Victims' childhood relationships with their parents affect their romantic relationships as adults. Most people's first real interpersonal relationships are with their parents. Famously, Sigmund Freud theorized that much of people's sexuality as adults can be traced back to their experiences as children. While many of Freud's most notorious theories, such as the problem of female hysteria, have fallen out of mainstream psychology, traces of his idea about the primary nature of parent-child relationships still persist. Some of Freud's successors, such as John Bowlby, developed theories about childhood that were less sensational and have been more enduring than Freud's. Bowlby was among the first psychoanalysts to suggest that the way parents interact with their babies greatly influences emotional development and communication styles. Babies whose physical and emotional needs were routinely met by their parents are more likely to grow up to be good communicators with healthy emotions, whereas babies whose needs were ignored or inconsistently met might experience more emotional difficulties later in life. Amir Levine, a psychiatrist who studies children's brains at Columbia University, and social psychologist Rachel Heller applied attachment theory to the world of adult romance, theorizing that the attachments formed in childhood directly inform the way people couple later in life. For example, a person who had neglectful parents might have a different communication style than someone who had attentive parents. Adults who seek to identify and understand their attachment type and how it may differ from their partners may improve the relationship. For a seducer, identifying the victim's attachment style is useful information that conveys how that person can best be manipulated. A heightened emotional state will cloud the victim's decision-making skills. Seducers should try to keep their target's emotions high, as people in heightened states of arousal are more easily swayed. Psychological research suggests that this tactic is effective because people's decision-making skills become impaired in emotionally charged situations. Certain demographics might be especially susceptible to this form of seduction. Researchers who tried to simulate the conditions of real-life financial fraud asserted that criminals frequently target elderly people for scams because they can be more easily manipulated. In one study, researchers found that older people were more likely to be swindled and take financial risks when their emotions were aroused. These emotional states didn't have to be negative. Positive emotions also seem to interfere with subjects' decision-making ability. For instance, criminals who can upset or excite a man in his 80s before presenting a fraudulent financial proposition have a much greater chance of defrauding the victim. The problem is compounded by criminals' knowledge that the elderly demographic is more susceptible to their deception, which means they're more likely to target older people in the first place. In such cases, the physical arousal that is associated with the emotion triggers the bad decision. For example, people who are angry are in a high state of physical arousal, whereas people who are sad may be more sluggish. Sometimes emotion is experienced as a chemical or hormonal release in the body. In recent years, researchers have grown more interested in the idea of gambling as a physical addiction, for instance. Some researchers argue that in a casino, gamblers' brains become so flooded with dopamine that their capacity for logical decision-making and rationality abandons them entirely. Seducers should avoid overtly controlling their victims. Instead, seducers should use hints and subtle suggestions to bring about the desired behavior. Seduction is in many ways an art of insinuation. Instead of making direct, explicit statements about what a victim should do, a skilled seducer will favor subtlety and stealth. When this technique is used correctly, victims might even mistake an idea that was planted by a seducer as their own. In How to Win Friends and Influence People, Dale Carnegie made it one of his core principles to avoid giving orders. Instead, he recommended asking questions, which helps provide others with an illusion of agency. In the parlance of seduction, which Carnegie did not use, the victim would feel more vested in a given action if it was proposed as a question instead of a demand. One of Carnegie's points was that human nature isn't really conducive to taking orders. An order might work in a context where a person has received a lot of training, like in the military, but civilians tend to offer up a little more resistance. Consider a colleague who asks her counterpart in another department if it would be possible to complete a task by the end of the week, as opposed to demanding it be finished by Friday. The latter is more likely to yield a better result. When asked nicely, people will often cooperate with the request if they can. The other benefit is that open-ended questions often result in better solutions than closed-ended demands because the victim has the opportunity to be creative. In terms of seduction, the question might be framed even more subtly.